All right, everyone, welcome back to Encyclopedia Hermetica Part 46. Last time we were together, we were talking about hell, or at least various manifestations of the underworld according to various ancient and medieval Mediterranean cultures. Today we're going to be tackling the flip side of this and discussing heaven. Graduating from the halls of Amenti, crossing the razor-thin rainbow road, or confirming one's name in the Book of Life before entering the pearly gates beyond the crystal sea. All right, well, maybe none of those instances specifically, but you can consider this lecture part of a mini-series within the Encyclopedia Hermetica that is not exactly chronologically ordered or geographically restrained, and is more or less a rambling concerned with the phenomena of heaven and hell, or as much less loaded terms, the celestial world versus the chthonic worlds. I'm not talking about a place where you go when you die, although there's always something to be said about that too. No, I'm generally talking about states of mind or conditions of consciousness. It's like the weather in your head. You can live in the kingdom of heaven, which is ordered and harmonious, in line with the Tao of the universe, if you will, or you can rebel against nature and suffer among the kingdom of the damned. Now, primitive notions of heaven were, like most abstract metaphysical concepts, rooted in physical concepts first, then extrapolated into abstract concepts with time. The two major contributing images to our conception of heaven were first the mountain, or the so-called high places, as they're called in the Bible, places such as Mount Sinai, Mount Zion, Mount Ida, Mount Olympus, Mount Nisa, and so forth, where gods and goddesses tend to live, right? Now, the second informing image of heaven is that of the great and orderly vault above us. That big black or blue thing filled with luminous bodies, the sun, the stars, the moon, all in their clockwork glory. There were other high places, such as tops of trees or poles or man-made towers, but these were more popular among people who didn't live in the immediate vicinity of mountains. The story of the Tower of Babel is an example of this kind of priestly artifice, trying to literally reach the gods, or at least be closer to them by climbing into the physical sky. Now, obviously these two images were inseparable from one another in generating our imagery of heaven. First off, these places are set apart and untouchable. That's literally the meaning behind the word sacred. It means set apart. Now, mountains were dangerous places to be in, especially in a time before health insurance. And so this idea of hiking up a mountain to find yourself, it didn't really exist back then, or at least it was extremely rare. This ties into our whole changing conception of what quote-unquote nature is. And honestly, nature wasn't really perceived as our friend until the works of the 19th century American transcendentalists convinced us that there was something sublime rather than murderous about nature. You know, walks and camping trips, that these things were nice and not putting your life at risk. Now, it was exceedingly rare for someone to climb a mountain, and so it was usually for spiritual or religious reasons that they did so. There's actually a popular Greek myth, and it's killing me that I can't remember the figure's name to get to the end of the story. But in any case, he was a shepherd who loses one of his flocks while he's grazing his herds on the slopes of Mount Olympus. And, well, like the parable of the lost sheep, what does a shepherd do when one of his 99 sheep wanders off? Well, he goes and gets it. So he starts his climb up the mountain, and here we get a long montage of the seasons changing as our friend climbs and climbs. Valleys turn into steep rocky slopes, which give way to sheer walls, but on he climbs, hearing his animal echoing off in the distance just out of reach. Soon enough, he reaches a wall of clouds, which he enters reluctantly, and then climbing on through the mist for what seemed like days, he finally breaks through the ring of clouds girding the peak of the mountain and finds himself at the foot of a titanic gold and marble palace, where he espies the gods reclining on their couches in indifference, drinking their nectar and eating their ambrosia. Well, like I said, I forget how this story ends, but I'm more so using it to illustrate a point. And I'm sure that the parallels with the story of Moses and the burning bush are leaping out at you as well. The gods are in the wilderness. They are where you are not. That's the top of the holy mountain, and that's where man goes to find heaven. These whole categories of physical, literal, or spiritual, allegorical bleed into one another. They are the one great thing. Now, it may have been the sheer magnitude, or the relative enormity of both mountain and sky, which first brought man's attention toward the idea of a hierarchy of internal states. Things like emotions. The underworld was a place of death and disorder. It was made analogous with chaos, uncertainty, fear, these kinds of negative emotions that overtake men. Whereas the world above was a place of luminous brilliance. It was a place of endless depth, of immutable order, of blessedness. And so it served as a surface upon which to map the very concepts of nobility or loftiness, order, balance, and so forth. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I don't know if this is just something that's ingrained in us from apehood, that is, that the tallest tree is the best tree, or if it has something to do with size, that is, that the big monkey gets all the ladies, but somewhere along the line, the idea of size became equated with good, and so mountains and skies, which are the two biggest things, became interconnected with power language, while the lowly, claustrophobic netherworld was interconnected with the language of weakness. Now, let's not forget that the Greeks had very clearly delineated hierarchies in among their gods. At the top of Homer's golden chain, at the top of windswept Olympus, there ruled a mighty sky god, Zeus, or Jupiter, Dios Pitar, the shining father, or the bright father, who represented the inner blue vault of the heavens, all the weather therein, and by extension, cosmic justice and order. He was the ultimate patriarch. If you were a feminist, you'd say he embodies the patriarchy itself. But notice how it is the god of heaven, not the god of the gloomy underworld, or of the raging sea, or even of the wide land, that stands supreme over all gods. And before Zeus, it had been Saturn/Kronos, also a sky god. And before him, Uranos, whose name is etymologically related to rainwater, or even our word urine. I like to think of these as layers of orderliness in the cosmos. The outer black canvas of the night, the one with the stars studded in it, well, that's Uranos. And then this great gaping vastness was broken up or castrated, as the myth goes, by Time, who was Kronos or Saturn, who separated the heavens and the earth, if you will. And then Zeus overthrows him, becoming the ruler of the cosmos, which he walls in with a blue dome, like a king walling in his jurisdiction. In any case, what I'm trying to get at is that the earliest notions of what constituted heaven were more animistic ones. They were more about taking the subjective phenomenon that is the physical world around them and then mapping it with spirits, that is, to permeate the mountains, the trees, and the stars with mind stuff, to reach out with the mind and touch those things, to name them, and thereby to interact with them. I can't say exactly when this happened, but it must have happened at a very early period in human development. And obviously, it happened very differently from one place to another. But from a very early period, shaman, or just regular old folks in ecstatic trances, were also exploring inner space, or the, let's say, metaterrestrial realms, the realm of forms within, their so-called spirit world, or the world of ancestors. They would then relate these experiences by using words which everybody could relate to. So the bird became the symbol of the heavenly ascent, or the serpent became the chthonic descent. And when you feel exalted, when the ground dissolves beneath your feet and your mind is going to be pulled out of your body from the very top of your head, how will you relate that to the tribe? Well, you sing them a song and tell them it was maybe like climbing a mountain or flying like a bird. Maybe a more sophisticated answer is that you were among the stars, or you were communing with the very planets themselves. Now, when I tell you I saw the great jeweled purple chrysanthemum spinning before me, refracting off light like a violent machine, and then opening its gaping maw to create a window into new dreams, it's because I definitely saw something, and that something was ineffable, but I'll try anyhow using the closest possible analogy to this physical world, and I think all of us can relate to purple flowers, machines, mouths, windows, and dreams. I don't actually have any other anchor in my maps of meaning to help clarify what it is that I saw. I might tell you that once upon a time I met the goddess. But truth be told, she didn't take the form of a literal woman. She was a warm, feminine, orange glow that overtook my field of vision. And that warm orange glow had along with it all the warmth and love that I had received from my mother as a child, but condensed into a disembodied ball of light on the back of my eyelids. Now, the problem with all of this is that it doesn't really mean anything to you. It doesn't help any of you in any way. So that's when everybody started applying metaglosses to other people's visions. We'll read Ezekiel later, but I'll tell you now, I don't think, as many biblical scholars think, that Ezekiel wrote his vision of the chariot to mean anything intrinsically, in the same way that the word hallelujah has no intrinsic meaning. I think the meaning was mapped over it at a later date, probably by an entirely different author or authors. I think prophets were people who had visions, and some wrote down what they saw, others just spoke what they saw, And then later interpreters are then the ones who figured out what it is these visions meant. The oracle at Delphi worked this way. The oracle goes on an inner journey, she brings back a few words, and then the interpreter explains to the querent what the visions actually meant. Just like the heavens themselves were thought of as being layered and stratified, our approach to someone else's mystical experience has to be layered and stratified. There's a great multitude of ways of interpretation, some arguably more valuable than others, but there are many nonetheless. But I think when we talk about quote-unquote heaven, we need to follow this general schema of, 1, there is a physical substrate. So we take in images of rocks and mountains and trees, orderly stars and planets, etc. 2, there's an altogether different quote-unquote mental substrate, which reveals itself in trance or in dream. It's detached from physical phenomena, which we can provisionally call non-physical. Here, all the images taken in from the physical world get jumbled up with pure form and formlessness, and then they're experienced firsthand in the mind's eye. And then 3, you have an interpretive dimension. Once you're back from your journey, reconstructing what you went through, where the things you saw have to be anchored to concepts in the quote-unquote real world, and unfortunately, this process of remembering and remapping things with words alters your memory of the actual event. Now, there's far more layers of interpretation, and in fact, I would say there's kind of a never-ending fractal of interpretations, but this will do for our purposes. What we're going to be exploring is literature about these kinds of experiences throughout time. We don't have first-hand access to Dante's Paradiso. We're not Dante. But at the very least, we can have our own experiences of this type. Then we can relate to the literary byproduct of Dante's experiences, or Enoch's, or Paul's, or whatever, and then shape our interpretations in accordance with our own personal experience. Ultimately, you can never reach into someone else's head and experience their qualia, experience their experience. But we can have our own experiences, acknowledge that we're all wired up somewhat similarly on account of our shared biology, and then use that as one of our many interpretive lenses. In my opinion, there are way too many people who treat these sort of works purely literally or perhaps purely allegorically, but I don't think it does it justice to most of our authors to think about it this way. Just a side on this idea of fractal interpretations that I mentioned earlier. What I meant by it was this. You can interpret a text in an infinite number of ways. You can start by interpreting a single word from it. You can broaden your parameters to include an analysis of 2 words, or 3, or 5, or 7, or of a single sentence, or of a whole paragraph, or of a whole chapter, or book, or author, or literary tradition. There's an infinity of ways to interpret a text, and some people say that there is a pragmatic hierarchy of ways to interpret the world, and others say that there isn't, and it's just one big power game. This is actually how postmodernism was born. I'm not going to go there here. In more traditional divisions of interpretive levels, we get things like the 7 layers of interpretation for the Quran, or we get the 4 layers of interpretation which the Jews use for the Torah. So there's the peshat, which means the surface or the literal interpretation of a text, the remez, which are the hints to the deep, that is allegorical or hidden or symbolic meaning, that is just beyond the literal sense. There's the derash, which is the Hebrew word meaning to inquire or to seek, and it's the comparative or midrashic meaning as it occurs in similar other occurrences. It's a kind of exercise in comparative literature. And then there's the sod, which is the secret, esoteric, or mystical meaning as given through inspiration or revelation. Then, of course, we've got things like the blasted but useful academic schools of interpretation, constructivism, structuralism, Marxism, feminism, postcolonial, Freudian, and so on and so forth ad nauseum. I'm going to be doing something a little different here because I have the freedom to do so. You could say that this is the mystical meaning as given through inspiration, but I would say that the mystical meaning is the lack of intrinsic meaning. It is the experience is itself. It isn't a signifier to something other than itself. It just is. All right. Now, if we're going to be talking about literature specifically, it really limits how far back we can go. I was racking my mind trying to think of what the oldest known Ascent or Anabasis narrative I could find was, and so I went to Gilgamesh first, and I found the story of Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, which I think is a little bit forced to call an Anabasis myth. So then I looked at Gilgamesh and his herb of immortality as well, but that's a catabasis motif. So here I am thinking, well, there's got to be some sort of antediluvian Anabasis story that I can pull up. And sure enough, I figured I'd start out with Enoch. Now, we need to realize that the stories of Enoch were written down at a fairly late period in history, at least the surviving stuff. It's 4th century BC at the earliest. But they're ultimately representative of a long line of oral tradition that stretches back into God knows when. Later, a post-rabbinical literary movement called Heikhalot literature, from the Hebrew word for palaces, as in the palaces of heaven, would evolve out of this tradition of writing, and this genre overlaps with Merkabah literature, as we'll see in Ezekiel. So it's safe to say that Enoch is the antediluvian, that is pre-flood, Hebrew culture hero around whom the whole discourse of mystical ascension revolved, insofar as Jews are concerned. The Dead Sea Scroll sect at Qumran was also very interested in Enoch and angelology and all that good stuff. So let's start with him, and no, I won't be reading the whole Book of Enoch or even part of it. Now, most of you already know the first part of the Book of Enoch describes the fall of the Watchers. This is the Hebrew version of the Anunnaki, Apkallu myths. These are basically fallen angels, you could say disembodied intelligences or pagan gods, who come into the daughters of men and father the Nephilim, that is, the Shemsuhor, or the giants. Now, some of these watchers share the names with the later Solomonic demons in Goetic magic. Some of them sound eerily similar to planetary archons in their descriptions. And so there's no shortage of theories, conspiracy or otherwise, surrounding this mythical event. It's a real hotbed for the ancient aliens folk, but that's not what we're after. We want to look at the remainder of the book and how it describes Enoch's visits to heaven in the form of what you could call visionary astral travel. Now, one of these books is quite a marvel, the astronomical book, as it contains detailed prose descriptions of the movement of the celestial bodies and of the firmament itself, what would probably later be called the first mobile. This sort of thing was related as a revelation to Enoch during his sojourn into heaven, guided by the hand of the archangel Uriel. This sort of plays out like one of the trippier episodes of Adventure Time. In it, we get a full description of a solar calendar, one which incidentally would be taken up by the Dead Sea sect. The year was composed from 364 days, divided into 4 equal seasons with 91 days each. Then each season was composed of 3 equal months of 30 days, plus an extra day at the end of the 3rd month, and then the whole year was thus exactly 52 weeks, and every calendar day occurred always on the same day of the week. Each year and each season started on a Wednesday, which was the 4th day of creation in Genesis, the day when the lights in the sky, the seasons, and the days and years were created. Now, I'm already going to stop myself here. This is the kind of thing where people are talking about when they say, see, these works aren't the product of ecstatic experiences. You can't just come up with this stuff in ecstatic psychobabble. This is science. Complaining that you can't just go into a trance, write stuff down, and then have it come out making any sense or offering any meaning to anyone. Well, this is why I talked about layers of interpretation first. You don't actually have to believe that someone, let alone Enoch, had a vision and downloaded all of this information in one go, wrote it down, and that was that. I think that one person had the visions, and then other people generated a visionary literary tradition, and they ascribed it to the first guy, and then some other people came along at a later date and used that literary tradition or myth to elaborate their own scientific or natural philosophical worldviews or observations. It's been postulated that every book in First Enoch was written by a different author, and so doubtless each of these were edited by a number of hands, and I've got no problem with this at all. But I won't deny that someone or some group at some point had a series of visions and talked about them before they were elaborated on in a text. What the visionary writer who put together the astronomical book was trying to impart was this sense of completion to his narrative. It's like this fullness of wisdom, what the Picatrix would later call the perfect or complete nature. And there's no better way to convey this sense of divine omniscience than by relating how the whole universe ostensibly works. We've got a description of the sun, the moon and its phases, the lunar year, the 12 winds and their portals, the 4 quarters of the world, the 7 mountains, the 7 rivers, and the 7 great islands, 7 being a number of completion, the waxing and the waning of the moon, a recapitulation of several laws, the perversion of nature and the heavenly bodies due to the fall of man, the heavenly tablets and the mission of Enoch, and then finally at line 82, the charge given to Enoch. It talks about the 4 intercalendary days, the stars which leads the seasons and the months, and so on and so forth. So there we have it. Some people made observations of the physical world. Some people had mystical experiences. Some people wrote about the qualia of their mystical experiences, and then some aligned their narratives with the natural philosophy du jour, and bam, a classic example of celestial ascent literature. It's this meeting place between scientific observation that is digging deep to find objectivity and spiritual observation, digging deep to explore subjectivity. We'll see something similar, but from a Greco-Roman perspective, later in the lecture concerning Scipio's dream that is written by Cicero. That's not how they all turn out, but that's how many do. Mystical experiences are like flexible canvases upon which lots of cultural data can be hinged. It's not a failed attempt at science, it's an augmented hyperreality, or maybe even science fiction, in the sense that it is a collected body of people's wisdom, it's scientia, and it is being framed in a cosmological narrative, a work of fiction. Not in the sense that it's fake, but in that it is made or composed. Fiction comes from the Latin verb facere, to do or to make. In any case, I will let you go through the book on your own. There are plenty of audiobook versions of it floating around if you'd rather listen to it, but I think you can't get the full picture of what I'm trying to explain without a good sense of what goes on in there. This does, however, give me a springboard to get into some reading. I'm speaking of Merkabah literature. So I think it's fitting here to give a reading from the Book of Ezekiel. But first, a word on its composition. Ezekiel was a Hebrew prophet. He's revered by all Judeo-Christian monotheistic religions as such. He supposedly lived during the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, where Tel Aviv is now, and all this during the time of the Babylonian captivity. Now, here's not the place to discuss who actually wrote the books attributed to Ezekiel, who edited them, and when. I'd rather stick to the more poetic and mystical dimensions of his text than to grind away at its historicity. We've talked about the world within which the prophets lived at a fairly early point in the lecture series, so let's let the text speak for itself, and here's where it starts. Right in medias res, right in the juicy bits. So I'm reading the first chapter of the Book of Ezekiel, New King James Version. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. On the 5th day of the month, which was in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. We get a switch in narrative here. Then I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself, and brightness was all around it, and radiating out of its midst like the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. Each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of calves' feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. The hands of a man were under their wings on their 4 sides, and each of the 4 had faces and wings. Their wings touched one another. The creatures did not turn when they went, but each one went straight forward. As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man. Each of the 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. Each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and each of the 4 had the face of an eagle. Thus were their faces. Their wings stretched upward, 2 wings of each one touched one another, and 2 covered their bodies. And each one went straight forward. They went wherever the Spirit wanted to go, and they did not turn when they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches going back and forth among the living creatures. The fire was bright and out of the fire went lightning. And the living creatures ran back and forth in appearance like a flash of lightning. Now, as I looked at the living creatures, behold, a wheel was on the earth beside each living creature with its 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels and their workings was like the color of beryl, and all 4 had the same likeness. The appearance of their working was, as it were, a wheel in the middle of a wheel. When they moved, they went toward any one of the 4 directions, and did not turn aside when they went. As for the rims, they were so high they were awesome, and their rims were full of eyes, all around the 4 of them. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Whenever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, because there the Spirit went, and the wheels were lifted together with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went. When those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted together with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. The likeness of the firmament above the heads of the living creatures was like the color of an awesome crystal stretched out over their heads. And under the firmament, their wings spread out straight, one toward another. Each one had 2 which covered one side, and each one had 2 which covered the other side of the body. When they went, I heard the noise of their wings, like the noise of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty, a tumult, like the noise of an army, and when they stood still, they let down their wings. A voice came from above the firmament that was over their heads, and whenever they stood, they let down their wings. And above the firmament, over their heads, was the likeness of a throne in appearance like a sapphire stone. On the likeness of the throne was a likeness with the appearance of a man high above it. Also from the appearance of his waist and upward, I saw, as it were, the color of amber with the appearance of fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his waist downward, I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire with brightness all around. Like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the brightness around it. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. All right, let's stop there. Now, there are as many interpretations to this text as there are hairs on your head. But what I'd like to do here is to highlight the qualia as best I can at the expense of the millions of posited meanings. Anyone who has had a mystical, near-death, out-of-body experience or whatever will immediately read these words and say, "Oh, I get it. I've been there. I know exactly what he's trying to get at." Whereas the people who haven't had those experiences will grope in the dark trying to attribute meaning to the vision like a Rorschach blot. I'd like to think there's a large degree of overlap between the esoteric and the exoteric crowd, but it hasn't been that way in my personal experience. The first thing we get is a great fiery whirlwind, colored like amber, coming out of the north. Okay, well, right away from that, what I can tell you is that he's trying to get at the confounding of categories, the great synesthesia which immediately precedes the experience. We've got wind, which is normally a thing that you feel with your sense of touch, but here it's visible and it's made of fire, which is hot dancing light, and it's likened to the visual qualities of a solid stone, of amber. We've got this elemental upheaval when God rolls out. Everything that is clearly distinguished in categories in the quote-unquote real world is just collapsed into one great sensory mess. This is something I've felt many times, and it is something I assume most of you have felt. This is actually an experience that can be experienced. Yes, it can be mapped with further meaning, it can be stripped of its subjective dimension and made into pure allegory, but this robs us of a critical portion of mankind's spiritual life, which is the first-hand experience of the one through the many. We have 5 senses, but in these states of heightened mental acuity, all of these bleed into one common sense, which feels like it's basically right in the center of your skull. Next, we have the emergence of these chimerical, zoomorphic figures coming out of the mix. Again, these have countless interpretations. I know Christians like to imagine these as the 4 gospel writers. Others have interpreted these as the 4 archangels. But this is all just part of a later mapping process. Again, if we want to go back to talking about the qualia of a mystical experience, we need to get rid of all these rigid words. The map is not the territory. If you go and you look at all these various artists' interpretations of what Ezekiel saw, they're all kind of static. They aren't churning and amorphous, suggestive of a vague, ever-changing form or figure rather than clearly delineated characters. When I imagine this scene, I think of dreamy nebulousness within which all opposites are reconciled, man and beast, man and machine, and of course man and God. We really overemphasize the literal interpretations. Who was the lion? Who was the eagle? Or who do they represent? And so on and so forth. But this comes at the expense of trying to imagine the world as Ezekiel saw it, with the collapse or confoundment of all mental categories at work. Next, we have a description of these beings and how akin to fire and lightning they were. Well, you're in this state of mind and your head is filled with hypnagogic phosphorescence, patterned bright lights and violent shapes. That's the nearest thing that you can anchor to it. So fire and lightning, amorphous visions of violent dancing light. What other words could you have used? He didn't have terms like phosphenes or hypnagogia. There was no way to taxonomize the experience except in terms relatable to the common man. Fire and lightning also conveys the fear. Fire and lightning were the most destructive forces in the ancient world, and so they elicit awe and wonder and fear and everything else that a vision of God would elicit. Coincidentally, the poet, Horace, the Latin poet, talked about the sublime as a thunderclap. All right, so next what we have is what I like to call the wheels within wheels within wheels within weird. I've seen these. They're like fractal cycles behind closed eyelids. They create a kind of inner clockwork pattern. But see, again, I have words I can use, like clockwork, which Ezekiel most certainly did not have. they're also said to look like beryl. In other words, the wheels are colorful and translucent, and they refract light like a crystal. This is what the visionary experience looks like. It's kind of like being inside of a spinning jewel, only that's just the visual descriptor. He didn't literally see a chariot. The chariot is just the closest thing that he could allude to in comparison. The wheel is one of the most ancient divine symbols, and it's because it spins in cycles, right? Which is ostensibly what every other thing is doing. The sun, the moon, the crops, the seasons, the life, the death, etc. And these sort of patterns, once internalized, become very pronounced during the mystical experience. It's no coincidence that samsara of the Hindu is conceived of as a wheel, and all those beautiful mandalas are attempts to capture that transcendent beauty into little pictures of the whole cosmos just before they're destroyed and all the colored sands are confounded into one another, into an undifferentiated primordial substance. Now, another detail on these wheels is something I think the visionary artist Alex Gray often captures exceedingly well, and it's kind of become the sine qua non of the style, and that's that the rims of the wheels are covered in eyes. There's something very psychedelic about the eye that I can't quite put a finger on, but it's definitely there. Ultimately, I think it symbolizes just pure awareness. We of the West have a tendency to hierarchize our senses with taste at the bottom and sight at the top. If we didn't do that, thanks to Plato, maybe our visionary art would have millions of ears and tongues too, but for the most part, awareness is symbolized by the eye, and infinite awareness is symbolized by an infinity of eyes. This leads me to think of an anecdote from my personal life. Whenever I find myself in these experiences, which can last anywhere from 5 to 12 hours, depending on a number of factors, the thing that creeps me out the most is at the end of the night when I have to take out my contact lenses. There's really nothing weirder than using your finger to poke your literal eyeball while you're in that state. That preciously fragile and tiny gateway to all the pure light in the world, and when you're actually causing the light to bend from the pressure that you're applying directly to your eye, it makes you really highly aware that the inside of you and the outside of you are actually one contiguous thing. And unless you're some kind of deeply enlightened yogi who lives in that state of mind at all times, it's always startling and very unsettling. It makes you ask yourself, who is the I behind the seer? The hearer, the toucher, the smeller, or the taster. You could lose all of these and still be conscious, but what would be left behind? Pure awareness. And that's what I think that these eyes are trying to symbolize, or that's the manifestation of this idea in visionary form. All right, now one of my favorite parts, and we're getting closer and closer to the heart of the vision, the peak of the holy mountain, if you will. And I'll read this line again slowly. The likeness of the firmament above the heads of the living creatures was like the color of an awesome crystal stretched out over their heads. So the likeness of the firmament, that is, the image or the reflection of the heavenly vault, it's this kind of oblique modality of vision. It's this infinite thing that is being condensed just above the head of these four chimeras, as if sitting atop of a chariot, and it's described with the color of crystal, which has no color at all, except maybe iridescence, which is both all the colors and none of the colors at the same time. Again, what we're getting to is this sense of everything and nothing. The ultimate mysterium conjunctionis. The reconciliation of all paradox. It was the sky itself, the firmament. He's now experiencing the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, and he's just scraping by in giving us his best words to describe something that cannot be described. And that's why it comes out sounding like madness. As you asymptotically approach the one, there are fewer and fewer things to say, and what you can say usually makes very little sense. Then, above the firmament over their heads, that is, above the sky itself, we're getting into metaphysical territory here, above and beyond this earthly realm, into the interworlds, if you will, there appeared the likeness, the image of a throne, that great symbol of absolute authority, shining like a sapphire, that is radiating a scintillating blue light. Then, over the likeness of the throne was, quote, a likeness with the appearance of a man high above it. Now, look how carefully oblique that is. It is the appearance of an image of a man. It doesn't just say, I saw a man. It's the reflection of a man. And he's shrouded in fire, in dancing and terrifying light. And then it says this, like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the brightness all around it. So it's iridescent. Lots of artists literally put rainbows around God, but I think there's a difference between literal rainbows and like the appearance of a rainbow. Now, where else have I experienced this? Now, Ezekiel writes, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. This was the image of the kabod of the Lord. So, the image of the gravity or weightiness of the one. That's what kabod or glory actually means. It's related to weight or gravity. And it's funny because here I am telling you through an image about the image of an image of an image about the glory of the one. Well, no wonder so much resolution is lost along the way. It's like a game of telephone gone foul. Now, if that isn't a description of the psychedelic state, that is, a state of mind manifestation, then I don't know what is. If you've personally had one or many of these experiences, then you can recognize it in an instant. If you've never had any kinds of visions like these, then you're going to be more interested in everything that comes after this portion of the text. That is, the practical application of the prophecy to the real world. I don't want to dismiss this, but I'm not going to get into it here. What there needs to be is someone to say at least something about the literary descriptions of heaven, of the chariots, of the glory of God, without trivializing them, linking them to states of mind that can be achieved through extreme fasting, meditation, exhaustion, drug use, etc. These are not airy-fairy literary fancies or daydreams. These are literally experiences people can and still do actually go through, and from which they take away deep meaning and significance to use in their daily lives. That's really what I'm trying to say. That these Anabasis stories we'll be exploring, these are real to a great extent, or at least indicative of an event that the author perceived as realer than real. I don't want to trivialize the role and impact these sorts of experiences have had on individuals, then by extension on families and on tribes, on nations, and by extent on the whole world. When Paul says he knew a guy who was swept up into the third heaven, whether in his body or out of it, let's take his word for it. It evidently meant something to him. I'm not saying that everyone who apparently gets swept up into heaven is an infallible demigod and that we should follow their commands as some kind of guru. I'm just trying to point out that history is punctuated by a great number of men and women who have mystical experiences, and that these are then reinterpreted through a specific cultural lens, especially when it comes to literature, and these ideas have massive ramifications. I don't want to say that they came from beyond, because that would trivialize the fact that they came from within the human heart. But what I do want to say is this, that this beyond that we're talking about actually lies also within the human heart. And by the way, if you're the skeptical type and you think I'm being wishy-washy with terms like mystical experience and so forth, that's fine. But know that even science confirms its existence as a phenomenon. I believe it's the work of Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University, who's compiling together studies to provide a standardized definition for a thing that has no standardized qualia. In any case, this lecture is more so preaching to the choir. If you've never had the experience, there's not much I can say to convince you it's real, and there's nothing I can say to convince you that it's not exclusively the weapon of a charlatan either. But there's plenty more to be said either way about Ezekiel and the prophets, but I'm going to move on because there's a lot of ground to cover. In fact, I think I'm only going to have enough time to look at one more text briefly before calling it a day, but we're going to resume at another time with more texts, eventually getting back to our more formal chronology. Now, in the spirit of throwing chronology to the wind, I want to give an example of a mystical experience pushed through the lens of Greco-Roman Stoic cosmology. The classic Somnium Scipionis. It was written by that great orator, that derivative eclectic philosopher, and that root of all Renaissance humanism, Marcus Tullius Cicero. It was modeled after the myth of in Plato's Republic, which I discussed in the last lecture, and it is the literary description of a fictional out-of-body experience or dream of the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus 2 years before he'd sack the city of Carthage and burn it to the ground in 146 BC. There's even a Mozart opera about it, Il Sogno di Scipione, Scipio's Dream. So during his travels in Africa, Scipio Aemilianus had been a guest at the court of King Massinissa, during which time he's visited by an apparition of his dead grandfather, Scipio Africanus. He's the hero of the Second Punic War. So he's taken out of his body and he finds himself up in the heavens looking down upon Carthage from a high place full of stars bright and shining. So there's that motif that we were talking about at the beginning of the talk. Now, I'm going to read you most of it, but I'm going to cut out the beginning just to make the text more concise. So, while they're floating above the world, Scipio's future is foretold by his grandfather. Something that's easily done when you're writing in the distant future of the events being described. By the way, this text would have a massive impact on the cosmological, Hermetic-type works of the Middle Ages, so listen carefully. Here it goes. We start with a quote from the ghostly grandfather Scipio Africanus to his living grandson Scipio Aemilianus. Do you see that city, which although forced by my arms to yield obedience to the Roman people, is reviving the recollection of wars of old and cannot rest in peace? Now he was showing me to Carthage, from a place on high, full of stars and bright shining, that city to attack which you are now coming almost as a private soldier? within these 2 years, you will destroy it as consul. And that title, which so far you bear as an inheritance from me, shall be won for you by your own achievement. But when you hast razed Carthage, celebrated a triumph, held office of censor, and traveled on a mission over to Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece, you will be elected consul a second time, though abroad, and you will bring a most important war to its close. You will utterly destroy Numantia, but when you ride in your car of triumph to the capital, you will find the state sorely troubled by the plotting of my own grandson. Here, Africanus, you must display to the fatherland the light of your courage, genius, and wisdom. But in that time, I see the march of destiny, so to call it, hesitating between 2 ways. For when your life has completed 7 times 8 full cycles of the sun, and these 2 numbers, each of which for a different reason is held to be a perfect number, in the revolution of nature has fulfilled your destined sum for you, to you alone and to your name the whole community will turn together. The Senate, all right-thinking citizens, the allies and the Latins will fix their eyes on you. You will be the one man on whom the community can lean for safety. And in short, as dictator, you must reform the Constitution, if only you can escape from the unnatural violence of your relations. But still, Africanus, so that you may be the readier to defend the Constitution, know this, for all who have preserved their fatherland, furthered it, enriched it, there is in heaven a sure and allotted abode, where they may enjoy an immortality of happiness. For nothing happens in the world more pleasing to that supreme deity who governs all the universe than those gatherings and unions of men allied by common laws which are called states. From this place do their rulers and guardians set out, and to this place do they return. Here, although I was greatly terrified by dread, not so much of death as of treachery from men of my own household, but I found courage to ask if he was himself alive, and my father Paulus and others whom we regarded as dead. Yes, indeed, they are alive, said he, who have soared away from the bonds of the body as from a prison house. But your life, as it is called, is really death. And so soon I began to be able to speak, having choked back my tears. Pray tell me, said I, most revered and best of fathers, since this is life as I hear Africanus say, why do I linger on earth? Why don't I hurry up and come to you there? It is not as you think, said he, for unless that God to whom all this region that you can see belongs has released you from keeping of your body, the entrance to this place cannot be opened up for you. For men were created subject to this law, to keep. To that globe which you see in the center of this region, and which is called Earth. And to them a soul was given, formed from those everlasting fires, which you mortals call constellations and stars, that, round and spherical in form, alive with divine intelligences, complete their orbits and circles with marvelous swiftness. So, my Publius, You and all good men must allow the soul to remain in the keeping of the body, nor without his command, by whom it was given to you, must you leave your human life, lest you should appear to have deserted the post assigned to men by God. But rather, my Scipio, like your grandfather here, like me, your sire, follow justice and natural affection, which, though great in the case of parents and kinsfolk, is greatest of all in relations to our fatherland. Such is the life that leads to heaven, and to this company of those who will now have lived their lives and released from their bodies dwell in that place which you can see. Now that place was a circle, conspicuous among the fires of heaven by the surpassing whiteness of its glowing light, which place you mortals, as you have learned from the Greeks, call the Milky Way. And as I surveyed them from this point, and all other heavenly bodies appeared to be glorious and wonderful, now the stars were such as have never been seen from this earth. And such was the magnitude of them, all as we have never dreamed. And the least of them all was that planet, which farthest from the heavenly sphere and nearest to our earth was shining with burrowed light, but the spheres of the stars easily surpassed the earth in magnitude. Already the earth itself appeared to me so small that it grieved me to think of our empire, with which we could cover but a point, as it were, of surface. And as I gazed upon this more intently, "Come," said Africanus, "how long will your mind be chained to the earth? Do you see into what regions you have come? See, the universe is linked together in 9 circles, or rather spheres, one of which is that of the heavens, the outermost of all, which embraces all the other spheres, the supreme deity which keeps in and holds together all the others, and to this are attached those everlasting orbits of the stars. Beneath this there lie 7, which turn backward with a counter-revolution to the heavens, and of these spheres that star holds one, which men on earth call Saturn's star. Next is that bright radiance, rich in hope and healing for the sons of men, which is called Jove's star. Then one fiery red and dreaded by the world, which you call Mars. Next, lower down, the sun holds nearly the middle region, the leader, the chief and ruler of the other lights, the mind and ordering spirit of the universe, of such magnitude that he illumines the whole and fills it with his light. With him Venus and Mercury keep pace as satellites in their successive spheres, and in the lowest zone of all the moon revolves, lighted up by the rays of the sun. Now, below these there is nothing more but what is mortal and transient, except those souls which the bounty of the gods has given to the sons of men. Above the moon all is eternal. As for the earth, the 9th and central globe, it does not move, but is the lowest point, and toward it all heavenly bodies tend by their own gravity. And as I gazed on these things with amazement, when I recovered myself, "What?" I asked. "What is the sound that fills my ears, so loud and sweet?" "This," he replied, "is that sound, which divided in intervals, unequal indeed, yet still exactly measured in their fixed proportion, is produced by the impetus and movement of the spheres themselves, and blending sharp tones with grave, therewith makes changing symphonies in unvarying harmony. For not only is it impossible that such vast movements should be swept on in silence, but by a natural law. The outermost parts on the one side give a grave, and on the other a sharp sound. Wherefore the highest of all, the celestial zone equipped with stars whose revolution is more swift, moves with a sharp high note, while this one of the moon, as it is the lowest, with the deepest tone of all. For the earth, which is the ninth, remaining motionless, is ever firmly planted in one spot, clinging closely to the center of the universe. Now the revolutions of those 8 spheres, of which 2 have the same power, produce 7 sounds with well-marked intervals. And this number, generally speaking, is the mystic bond of all things in the universe. And all learned men, by imitating this with stringed instruments and melodies, have opened for themselves the way back to this place, even as other men of noble nature who have followed godlike aims in their life as men. But the ears of men, overpowered with the volume of the sound, have grown deaf, and you have in you no duller sense than that of hearing. For instance, at the Katadupa, as it is called, where the Nile rushes headlong from the very high mountains, the tribe which dwells near that spot, owing to the loudness of the noise, has lost their sense of hearing. But this sound of the whole universe, revolving at the utmost speed, is so awful that the ears of men cannot contain it, just as you are unable to look straight at the sun, and your eyesight and its perception are overpowered by its rays. Though marveling at these wonders, I still kept turning my eyes at intervals toward the earth. Thereupon, "I see," said Africanus, "that you are even now regarding the abode and habitation of mankind. And if this appears to you as insignificant as it really is, you will always look up to these celestial things, and you won't worry about those of men. For what renown among men, or what glory worth the seeking, can you acquire? You see that on the earth only scattered and narrow plots are inhabited, while even in the very patches, as it were, in which men dwell, vast deserts are interspersed, and among those that live on the earth, there are not only such breaks that no communication can pass at all from one set to another, but some live in opposite zones, some on opposite sides of a zone, and some even at the opposite point of the earth to you, and from these, at any rate, you can expect no glory. Moreover, you see that this earth is girdled and surrounded by certain belts, as it were, of which 2 of the most remote from each other, and which rest upon the poles of the heavens at either end, have become rigid with frost, while that one in the middle, which is also the largest, is scorched by the burning heat of the sun. 2 are habitable. Of these, that one is the south, men standing in which have their feet planted right opposite to yours, has no connection to your race. Moreover, this other, in the northern hemisphere, which you inhabit, see how small a measure it concerns you? For all the earth which you inhabit, being narrow in the direction of the poles, broader east and west, is a kind of little island surrounded by the waters of the sea, which you, on earth, call the Atlantic, the Great Sea, the ocean. And yet, though it has such a grand name, see how small it really is. And yet of these very lands, which are frequented and familiar, could your name or that of any of your race have climbed beyond the summit of the Caucasus here, or crossed the waters of the Ganges there? Who in the other remote regions of the rising or the setting sun, or of the north or the south, will hear your name? Yet, leaving these aside, you can certainly see in what narrow field your human glory aspires to spread. Again, the very men who talk of you, how long will they talk? Why, even if it is those generations of men who care to hand it down in succession from father to son, the glory of each one of us, yet still, owing to the deluges and the conflagrations of the earth, which must happen periodically, we cannot acquire lasting, much less an eternal, renown. Nay, what does it matter that the mention should be made of you by those who shall be born hereafter, when there was none among those who were born before you? There were not fewer in number, but were, at any rate, better men. The more so, as among those very men by whom our name may possibly be heard, no one can secure his reputation for a single year. Men, to be sure, commonly measured the year by the return of the sun, that is, of a single heavenly body. But when all the constellations together shall have returned to the same point from which they once started, and after long intervals shall have restored the order of the whole heaven as it was before, then can that really be called the year of revolution, in which I hardly dare to say how many generations of men are comprehended. For as at that time, when the soul of Romulus made its way to these heavenly regions, the sun appeared to men to disappear and to be darkened, so whenever, in the same quarter and at the same time, the sun is again eclipsed, then, all the constellations and stars having been restored to their original position, you can say that a year has been fulfilled. But of this year, know that as of yet, not a 20th part has come around. So should you have lost hope for the return to this place, on whom great and illustrious men rest all their hopes, what then is your human glory worth, which can hardly affect a scanty portion of a single year? Therefore, if you will choose to look aloft, and fix your gaze on this our resting place, an eternal home, nor ever enslave thyself to the rumors of the rabble, nor stake the hope of your life on the rewards of men, virtue must draw you by her own attraction to true glory. What others say of you, let that be their own concern, but still they will talk. However, all that talk of theirs is both confined within those narrow bounds which you can see, and has never been of long continuance in the case of any. It is buried with the men themselves, and ends in the forgetfulness of posterity. When he had ended, for my part, I said, Africanus, if indeed a pathway, as it were, is opened to the gates of heaven for those who have deserved well of their native land, although I have not failed to do you honor, from my boyhood, treading in my father's footsteps, and in yours, yet now, with so great a prize before me, much more watchfully will I strive. Strive indeed, said he, and be persuaded of this. It is not you that are mortal, but this body. For you are not that which your bodily form presents to view, but it is the mind of any man that is the man, not that figure which can be pointed out by the finger. Know then that you are a god, since he is a god who possesses force, feeling, memory, and prescience, who directs, governs, and moves that body of which he is the master, just as much as the supreme God of all moves this universe. And as the universe, which is in some degree perishable, is moved by God, who is himself eternal, so is the frail body moved by an immortal soul. For that which moves all the time is eternal. But that which imparts motion to something else, and itself receives its motion from some other source, must have a limit to its life, because its motion can end. Therefore, that only which moves of itself, because it never abandons itself, so it never ceases to move. Moreover, this is the source. This is the original cause of motion to all other things that move. Now, an original cause has no origin, for all things originate from it, but the original cause itself cannot arise from anything else. For it would not be an original cause if it had originated from something else. And as it has no origin, so it never perishes. For if the original cause once perish, it will neither be itself reproduced by another, nor will it create another from itself, since all things must necessarily spring from the original cause. Hence we see that the original cause of motion resides in that which is itself self-motive. Now that can neither be born nor die, otherwise the whole of heaven and all of nature would collapse and come to a standstill, nor would it find any power to give it the first impulse of motion. Since, therefore, it is plain that what is self-motive is eternal, who can deny that this quality is an attribute of our souls? For whereas everything is soulless that receives its impulse from without, that, on the contrary, which has a soul, moves by an inward motivation of its own. For this is the natural property and essence of the soul. And if this is the only thing in the world that is self-motive, assuredly it has had no beginning but is eternal. Exercise this soul in the noblest of activities. Now, the noblest are cares and exertions for our country's welfare. And the soul which has been enlivened and trained by these will speed more fleetly to this its resting place and home. And this will it do more readily if, even while still imprisoned in the body, it strains beyond it, and surveying that which lies outside of it as much as possible, endeavors to withdraw itself from the body. For the souls of those who have given themselves over to the pleasures of the body, and have yielded themselves to be their servants, as it were, and at the prompting of those lusts which await upon pleasures, have broken the laws of God and man, when they have glided from their bodies, go groveling over the face of the earth, nor do they return to this place except after many ages of wandering. And so he departed, and I awoke from my dream. And with that, my friends, let us also awake from his dream. I'll let the text stand on its own in the light of the other lectures that we've done together on the subject, namely on Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, etc. We'll continue this subject of Anabasis or celestial ascent at another time, but for now, you've been listening to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, Part 46, and I am your humble, rambling librarian, Dan Atrell.